Okay, so today I decided to introduce uh, a few more things about me and then go into a mini lecture that I have created uh, for the public. Generally, my research interests focus on native land acquisition and natural resource management. And what I intend to do with that is uh, create a new dialogue about how we can promote a better understanding of how individual people associate with the environment. I think many people have heard at least a little bit in some of their history courses, and that's probably all it is a little bit, that native peoples were on this continent when Europeans got here, that they're this separate entity, this other ethnic or racial group. And really, it's more than that, but that's simplifying it for the time being. And throughout history, between native peoples and Europeans, uh, what we have come up with is a really interesting relationship between native peoples who are still here on this continent uh, and the colonizing authority is the United States, the larger culture, the dominant society. So throughout this really awkward history, we see that there are, in fact, a lot of ways that people have created, or at least started to think about native peoples and their relationship to the land. And the history between these two people, the native peoples, generally speaking, and the United States itself, uh, we have some issues that have arisen. Now, native peoples today hold only a fraction of the land that they held when Europeans came to this continent. A lot of things changed with the expansion and the types of power that Europeans came to this continent with, in addition to disease and other promises and ways of negotiating, political theory, economic theory, natural resource management, all these different components that we see today were so different in a lot of ways, even though there were some similarities between native peoples and Europeans, such as the desire to live as fully and as happily as we can. I think that's something that a lot of people can agree on. But between contact with Europeans and to present day, we see that there's a lot of issues because native peoples themselves, living only on that fraction of land that they were able to maintain and keep, uh, developed other problems. Uh, they were no longer allowed to live in a way that can promote uh, full economic development, cultural sustainability, and other aspects of life. And so now with this little bit of land that we have set around for the native peoples of North America, and specifically the United States, that's my general region of focus, um, even though Canada has done a lot of the same things now and seems to be regressing, but we can get onto that in another lecture. What we have now is I want to study more and provide an even deeper rationale for why it is that native peoples need to actually acquire more land. This is not really a problem that they should have to take on specifically because, in fact, they were confined to this current way of life under this current economic system by the colonizing authority. So it's not really their fault that they have to live under this now and that under such a very quick turnaround be expected to flourish. Some native nations are flourishing, and that's great news. But more importantly, we have to be able to focus on other alternatives to economic development, cultural revitalization, and environmental sustainability. It's actually an important component. So, my general research ideas are going to focus on native land acquisition and how native peoples interact with their environments through the management or stewardship of their natural resources. And what I seek to do here is to provide a very deep rationale for land acquisition, whether it be through public trust, which is what the main system Native peoples work with now. Uh, that needs to be tweaked, but again, we'll get onto that another time. And then natural resource management. How is it that Native peoples can manage the natural resources that they have now? So, and of course, bringing those two things together to show that this connection to the land and natural resources that has been studied so very well. It's very apparent through current literature that Native peoples maintain, indigenous peoples maintain a relationship to their natural environments. And that's true. That's a very well established scientific thought. But what I want to do is to further that, because it's all well and fine for us to say those things, but we need to look beyond what that's supposed to mean. So what does that mean? And so that's exactly the region, the area of study that I will be undertaking in the next few years, at least at the beginning of my career. And the first area that I want to start with is a combination between economic development and land acquisition. It should come as no surprise for many people who have any understanding at all of the economic system that we're under. It's capitalism, but it's not strictly capitalism. It's overwhelmingly capitalist, yes, and many of us benefit from that. Probably, I can say all of us do in some way or another. But it also has its issues as well. But we also have a socialist system, and we also have a communistic system. We have national parks. We like that. That's communistic. We have healthcare, certain types of social welfare programs that are covered under socialism. And while there's hotly political debates over what's good for people and what isn't, the fact of the matter is that we have that in the United States right now. We have a combination of things in place. So my ideas come from learning about how Native peoples themselves are managing their economic development. Now, as I said earlier, many of the economic systems that we have in place around the United States, Native peoples were put into that system, okay? And they're not asking for some special privilege or special way out of it. They're just asking, hey, let's try to make this playing field a little better for us. After all, you had this experience from these types of political theories when you were back in Europe. So now you came over here and you instituted these systems here on this land, and you're making us look at things a little bit differently in order to succeed. Because we have a very massive economic system that transcends the states. This is a national economic system. This is not some state-oriented system. And so a result of that, and perhaps a reason for that, is we have a pretty strong national government. Now, a lot of people I have heard from students and non-students is that Native people seem to have some special insight into socialism or communism, and that Native peoples themselves actually seem to operate those systems much more. And I am here to argue against that because I don't think that's actually the case. Capitalism, socialism, and communism are all European-based ideologies that how we see them working today are European-based. They're not Native American, indigenous-based at all. And so to come over here and to say that, oh, the Native peoples were actually living in a socialistic societies or communistic would be inaccurate, because the kind of economic system that these nations had before, it's not exactly the same thing that they have now. But we see a lot of good examples today about some Native communities being able to exploit natural resources in a good way, but also maintain cultural programs within their nations. I just moved here to Logan, Utah, from Durango, Colorado, and there we were living around Ute territory, and I'm living very close to that right now too. But the Southern Utes are a very wealthy tribe, and they're able to manage their natural resources in a much more positive way, but also be able to promote cultural revitalization in positive ways as well. So while they are in fact participating in some of the economic systems that we have today, we also see that they do things a little bit differently than the states and then the federal government. And I think that's worth noting. Now that's just one example, and it's something relevant to me because I just came from Durango, Colorado. Now, I do not think, though, that we can simply say that the Southern Ute Nation must have some sort of special insight into what capitalism is supposed to mean or what socialism is supposed to mean. I think, though, that it's easier to say that we've come together, the Southern Ute have, for instance, as the example, and created this type of middle ground. In previous Native American studies literature, we see some of that. And it's not, the middle ground is this figurative and literal place where the indigenous and the Europeans were able to come to this table and say, okay, we're going to hammer out these ideas and we're going to begin to understand and work with these people as legitimate individuals, as a legitimate society. And I think that that's a positive thing. In fact, I think that there should be a middle ground today, that it shouldn't just be that the native peoples have to play ball on the same exact turf as the colonizing authority. And so some of my research interests and some of these ideologies about economic development are focusing on how native peoples maybe should force the United States back to the table. Now, it's hard to do that when you don't have seemingly a lot of power or authority to do so. But when we see some of the examples around here, I consider the Southern Ute example to be something very important because they're operating in traditional ways, but also in modern ways. And modern meaning capitalism, and traditional meaning they do adhere to certain cultural norms and standards within their nation. But they bring them together, and then they're able to promote economic development of their peoples. And I know for a fact that they're not exploiting their natural resources unnecessarily, that they're trying their best to work within the confines of a system where they can promote the longevity of their people. And the only way to do that is to use their natural resources effectively. So that's a good example to me. I took some time and learned a lot about the people there. After all, I was living on their lands. And really just took the time to understand that there were certain things that this nation did that promoted its economic development and its long-term sustainability and viability as a people. Now, that isn't to say, though, that there aren't problems. Because in our current democratic system, we have a very terrible problem, right? It's not something that people love to talk about or to really acknowledge at a deeper level that is our democracy working the way it should? So, kind of hitting on all these different bases, but I'm working up to a point because it's important to get some of these ideas out there. And again, this is for discussion. I'm not saying this way is the perfect way, because there is no perfect way. Capitalism looks great on paper. Socialism doesn't sound that bad itself, and communism itself doesn't even sound that terrible. I mean, we're saving land, we're thinking long term. And so it's the implementation of these programs, these economic theories, these systems that show that there's a lot of work to be done. So in the United States, we have capitalism, socialism, and communism all in this big ball of rubber bands, and we keep pulling them and are flipping back at each other, and it's knocking the ball this way and that way, and some people are happy about it, some people aren't, but a lot of people are just really concerned because there's a lot of issues with our current system. Fortunately, I think that there's a way out. it just takes some work. And I think that a lot of academics and a lot of non-academics would see that in the same way. We don't have to maintain the status quo and keep everybody down like we have been, but we do have to work hard to revisit it. Let's not get rid of capitalism. Let's not do that. Let's keep it, but let's tweak it. Let's make it better. Let's be able to show that, hey, this is the United States of America, and we can, in fact, still do something that can be a good example to other people. Now, that's a little harsh, maybe it sounds a little harsh, but there's a lot of people not happy with us, even a lot of us citizens of the United States. So, I think that the United States can look to people like Native Indigenous peoples for examples of this. That despite the really awful history, the massacres, the lies, the broken promises, the broken treaties, still going on now, by the way, with the sequester that went down earlier this spring, Native peoples were hit pretty hard, and a lot of their treaty obligations were abrogated. They were broken because of the sequester. So that's another problem in and of itself. That's not helping Native peoples. But despite that, there are nations, the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, the Southern Ute in southern Colorado, who are actually focusing a little bit more on some of the good things that they can do. And they're bringing together traditional aspects of their cultures with the modern ideologies that came from Europe. And they're becoming successful. Again, that's not to say that there aren't problems there, because there are. Nothing can be perfect, meaning 0% unemployment. That would be economically infeasible. But there are things that people can do to promote economic development on their homelands or in their communities, whether they're indigenous or not. And so lately I'm working on this paper that looks at some of the relevant policies between the United States and the indigenous peoples, and I hope to demonstrate the need for the emergence of a middle ground between Native peoples and the federal government, and that the federal government can actually take some of their own lessons from the indigenous peoples. After all, the things that we've had to go through and how our nations had to develop, and yet some people are doing it very well. And again, there are many variables for that, okay? And we can get into this really, really deep discussion over why those things are the case. But I think that it's important for people to realize that there's actually hope out there for indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples in how we govern our nations, and how we have those relationships together, and how we can actually promote healing. Last year, we had a UN special reporter who came in, interviewed a bunch of Native peoples. A bunch, we can say that, a bunch, I suppose. And he basically came down and said, hey, you have to stop this discrimination, you have to make this healing occur. And I agree, but I think that's an oversimplification of what the issue really is about. And that's going to be a subject for another lecture later. But economic development that occurs with Native nations really does need to focus on bridging together traditional cultures with the modern society. And I think that the dominant culture itself should take examples and take note of how indigenous peoples do that, because of the things that they did have to go through. So ideally, I would call for a much bigger revision of our current economic system. And I think that the federal government and state governments and local governments can work with indigenous peoples to ensure their economic development. Now, that's going to take more land. It just comes down to that. Maybe part of this healing will be land acquisition, and that's exactly what I'm trying to work on with a few different peoples is that land acquisition, because economic development, cultural sustainability, environmental restorations, they just cannot really occur that well without a very vital natural resource, and that is the land. And that's exactly where there was the big push for expansion in the United States by Euro-Americans. And so it's a very important thing. But we have to find better ways to promote these developments, and I think that we can do that. And I'm optimistic that we can, so long as people want to take on the kind of work that it's going to require. So, to recap some of the things that I mentioned, Native American peoples prior to European contact did not have the economic isms of Europe: capitalism, socialism, communism. It doesn't really fit many indigenous philosophies. So it would be an oversimplification to classify Native peoples within those categories. And so what we have is Native peoples developing, some more successfully than others, and for a variety of reasons, the kinds of things, or the kind of system they need to survive. How can we play this game yet maintain our own cultural autonomy and our own sovereignty? And that's a very tricky game. It's a really tricky game. And there's a lot of politics involved. Tribal politics can be just as messy as federal politics. And so if more people notice that, I think that there would be an emergence of a middle ground. And ultimately, for indigenous peoples, I think the pursuit of a middle ground with the federal government is so important. And there's just not enough understanding of indigenous issues and how that relates to the broader concerns. What happens to the lowest of people? And some would say that Native people are among the lowest, not because they just are bad people or anything like that, but because we are some of the poorest people in this country. And oftentimes we are forgotten about because of that. Because maybe some of us look just like the general population. Me, for example. Even though I have heritage and a very keen understanding to my community, it's very important to me. And I had to go through a lot of the same things that other Native peoples and Native communities had to go through as well, just with a different face. So, as I start my research agenda here, in land acquisition and natural resource management, and trying to understand how land and natural resources influences different things among Native peoples, from economic development to cultural revitalization, and other ways and other methods of natural stewardship, these things are in my mind, because there's never just one solution to a problem. Not really. There's oftentimes a number of things that need to be dealt with in a number of different ways, a diverse portfolio of solutions. And for something as dear to me as indigenous issues, I think that what we have here is a very good possibility to pursue economic development for the United States, but also for Native nations around the continent. So that's the first lecture for this time. Feel free to comment or contact me. You can comment right here on my YouTube page, or if you're on my Facebook, that'd be a good place to do that as well. Or you can contact me via email, nichlas@ummons@usu.edu. That's my professional account and a good way to contact me. So please feel free to do that, and let's start talking about things. You don't agree with anything I said at all. I'm not really offended by it, and I would be happy to go on more with you about some of my ideas, because it's not really something I just pulled out of my head. It's something that I've been thinking about and reading about, and have been formulating some of these ideas for some time. So hopefully we can start some dialogue, as small as it may be, and promote a type of change that can be meaningful to not just the general population of Americans, but the indigenous peoples as well, the first of their kind. So um, contact me if you'd like, and we'll be back soon.